Think poor settlers in the Wild West had access to food whenever they needed it? The reality was that starvation was a constant threat, and wild fruits were often the only thing standing between survival and death. These weren't pleasant snacks or treats. They were desperate measures that kept people alive when everything else failed. Their struggle wasn't about enjoying nature's bounty. It was about choking down bitter, astringent fruits that would make you sick if you ate too many, but would keep you from starving if you didn't. And it all started with one brutal truth. If you couldn't afford cultivated fruit, you ate what grew wild, or you went hungry. Chokecherries were everywhere across the plains, and they lived up to their name in the worst possible way. These small, dark berries were so astringent that eating them raw would make your mouth pucker, your throat tighten, and your entire face contort in disgust. But poor settlers ate them anyway because the alternative was having no fruit at all. The tannins in chokecherries were so strong that your mouth would feel dry and rough for hours after eating them. Your tongue would stick to the roof of your mouth. Saliva production would stop. The sensation was deeply unpleasant, but hunger made people tolerate it. Eating too many raw chokecherries would make you sick. The pits contained compounds that could cause nausea and digestive problems, but poor families would eat them anyway, spitting out the pits and hoping they didn't consume enough to get seriously ill. Most settlers tried to process chokecherries into something more palatable. They'd boil them with whatever sugar they could afford to make preserves. But sugar was expensive, so poor families often made chokecherry preserves with minimal sweetening. The result was a bitter, barely edible spread that was better than nothing but not by much. The labor of processing chokecherries was intense and time-consuming. The pits had to be removed, or the preserves would be even more bitter and potentially dangerous. Poor women and children would spend hours pitting tiny cherries, their hands stained dark purple from the juice. The stains wouldn't wash out for days, marking them visibly as people who foraged for survival. Other settlers could look at someone's purple-stained hands and immediately know they were poor enough to be gathering chokecherries. The social stigma was real and painful. Children hated chokecherry picking. The bushes grew in thickets that were difficult to navigate. The branches would scratch exposed skin, and the reward for all this effort was fruit that tasted terrible. But families needed the food, so children picked. Chokecherries ripened in late summer, and the harvest window was short. If you missed it, the birds would strip the bushes clean within days. Poor families had to drop everything when the chokecherries ripened, even if it meant missing paid work. The free food was worth more than a day's wages, but chokecherries weren't the only bitter survival fruit that poor settlers relied on. Wild plums grew along creek beds and in thickets throughout the frontier. These weren't the sweet, juicy plums you'd find in an orchard. They were small, sour, and had large pits with very little flesh. But they were free. And for poor settlers, free meant survival. The plums were maybe an inch in diameter at most. The pit took up most of that space, leaving a thin layer of flesh that was intensely sour. You'd have to eat a dozen wild plums to get the same amount of fruit as one cultivated plum, but poor families would gather them by the bushel. Finding wild plum thickets was knowledge that families guarded jealously. The best spots were passed down through generations or discovered through hours of searching. Once you found a productive thicket, you'd return to it every year and hope nobody else discovered it. Competition for wild plums was fierce and sometimes violent. Families would arrive at a thicket to find others already picking. Arguments would break out over who had the right to harvest. Some disputes ended in physical fights, with desperate people willing to battle over free fruit. The harvest was backbreaking work. Wild plum thickets were dense and thorny. You'd have to reach deep into the branches to get the fruit, getting scratched and poked in the process. Children would emerge from plum thickets with torn clothes and bleeding arms. The plums had to be processed quickly because they'd spoil within days in summer heat. Poor families would work through the night, pitting plums and making preserves. The labor was exhausting, but the alternative was watching the fruit rot while your family went hungry. Wild plum preserves were intensely sour, even with added sugar. Most poor families couldn't afford enough sugar to make them truly palatable. The preserves would make your face pucker with every bite, but they provided vitamins and calories that kept people alive through winter. Some families would dry wild plums instead of making preserves. The dried plums were hard as rocks and had to be soaked before eating. They weren't pleasant, but they lasted for months and took up minimal storage space. The social implications of eating wild plums were similar to chokecherries. It marked you as poor. Children who brought wild plum preserves to school would be mocked by middle-class children who had apple butter from their family orchards. But at least wild plums had some sweetness when fully ripe. Other wild fruits were bitter no matter when you picked them. Wild grapes grew on vines along rivers and streams throughout the West. These weren't the plump, sweet grapes from vineyards. They were tiny, mostly seed, and so sour they'd make your eyes water. But poor settlers gathered them because they were abundant and free. The grapes were the size of peas, maybe a quarter-inch in diameter. Each grape was mostly a large seed with a thin layer of flesh around it. The flesh was intensely sour and sometimes bitter. Eating them fresh was an exercise in desperation. The vines grew high in trees along riverbanks, making harvest dangerous. Settlers would have to climb trees or use long poles to reach the grapes. Falls were common, and injuries from falling while picking wild grapes killed or crippled people regularly. The labor of picking enough wild grapes to matter was enormous. The grapes were scattered along the vines rather than in tight bunches like cultivated varieties. A full day of dangerous climbing might yield only a few pounds of fruit. But labor was all poor people had, so they spent it gathering free food. Most wild grapes were dried into raisins because they were too sour to eat fresh. The dried raisins were hard as pebbles and had to be soaked before eating. They weren't pleasant, but they provided concentrated calories and could be stored indefinitely. Some settlers would try to make wine from wild grapes. The wine was harsh and acidic, barely drinkable even by frontier standards. But alcohol was valuable, and wild grape wine could be traded or sold to supplement meager incomes. The seeds in wild grapes were a constant problem. You couldn't avoid them because they made up most of the grape's volume. Eating wild grapes meant constantly spitting out seeds. Children would have contests to see who could spit seeds the farthest, making a game out of unpleasant necessity. Wild grapes ripened in late summer and early fall, competing with other wild fruits for harvest time. Poor families had to prioritize which wild fruits to gather based on abundance and accessibility. Sometimes they'd miss the wild grape harvest because they were gathering something else. But some wild fruits were actually pleasant to eat, which made them highly competitive and sometimes dangerous to harvest. Service berries, also called June berries, were the exception to the rule that wild fruits tasted terrible. These berries were actually sweet and pleasant when ripe. They tasted similar to blueberries with a slight almond flavor. This made them highly sought after and fiercely competed for. The berries grew on shrubs in mountain regions and along streams. They ripened in early summer, hence the name June berries. The harvest window was short, maybe 2 weeks, and the competition was intense. Families would guard their service berry picking spots like treasure. Some would camp near productive bushes to ensure they got the harvest before others. Territorial disputes over service berry patches led to violence more than once. People were willing to fight over fruit that actually tasted good. The berries were small but abundant when you found a good patch. A productive service berry shrub could yield gallons of berries. Poor families would pick until their hands were stained purple and their backs ached from bending over bushes. Children actually enjoyed picking service berries because the berries tasted good, enough to eat while picking. This was rare with wild fruits. Most wild fruits were so unpleasant that you wouldn't eat them during harvest, saving them all for processing. Service berries could be eaten fresh, dried, or made into preserves. All three methods produced food that was actually enjoyable rather than merely tolerable. This made service berries valuable beyond their nutritional content. They provided pleasure in lives that had very little. The problem was that service berries were limited in distribution. They didn't grow everywhere, and not every family had access to them. Those who lived near serviceberry patches had a significant advantage over those who didn't. Birds competed aggressively for serviceberries. Flocks would descend on ripe bushes and strip them clean in hours. Poor families had to harvest early in the morning before birds became active, or they'd lose the entire crop to wildlife. Bears also loved serviceberries and would feed on them extensively. Encountering a bear while picking serviceberries was a real danger. Several settlers were killed or injured by bears defending their feeding spots. But not all wild fruits required competing with wildlife. Some grew in places where only the desperate would look. Elderberries were abundant throughout the West. Growing in damp areas and along streams, they were free and plentiful, which made them attractive to poor settlers, but they came with a serious problem. Raw elderberries could make you sick. The berries contained compounds that caused nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea if eaten raw. Poor settlers learned this the hard way, with families getting violently ill after eating raw elderberries. The knowledge that elderberries required cooking was passed down, but newcomers to the frontier would sometimes make the mistake. Cooking elderberries broke down the toxic compounds, making them safe to eat. But this meant poor families couldn't eat them fresh as a quick snack while hungry. They had to gather them, bring them home, and process them before they could be consumed. The processing was time-consuming and required fuel for cooking. Poor families living in areas with scarce firewood had to weigh whether the elderberries were worth the fuel needed to make them edible. Sometimes they'd gather elderberries and then not have enough wood to cook them properly. Elderberry preserves were dark purple, almost black, and had a distinctive flavor that some people found unpleasant. The taste was strong and slightly medicinal. Children often refused to eat elderberry preserves, but parents would force them because food couldn't be wasted. Elderberry wine was common among poor settlers who had the knowledge and equipment to make it. The wine was harsh but drinkable, and it provided a way to preserve the berries for long periods. Some poor families would make elderberry wine to sell, generating small amounts of cash income. The flowers of the elderberry bush were also edible and could be made into tea or fried into fritters. Poor families used every part of the plant they could, wasting nothing. This complete utilization was necessary for survival. Elderberries ripened in late summer, competing with other wild fruits for harvest time and labor. Poor families had to make strategic decisions about which wild fruits to prioritize based on abundance, ease of harvest, and nutritional value. The social stigma of elderberries was less severe than some other wild fruits because elderberry wine and preserves were also made by middle-class families. But the quantity you gathered still marked your social class. Gathering bushels of elderberries indicated poverty. Speaking of fruits that grew in difficult places, some wild berries required enduring pain to harvest. Blackberries and raspberries grew wild throughout the West, but harvesting them was painful, dangerous work. The thorns on these plants were vicious, tearing skin and clothing with every reach into the brambles, but the berries were sweet when ripe, making the pain worthwhile for poor families. The thorns weren't just sharp, they were barbed, meaning they'd catch in skin and clothing and tear when you pulled away. Children would return from blackberry picking with scratched arms, torn clothes, and sometimes serious cuts that would become infected. Poor families couldn't afford to replace torn clothing, so blackberry picking meant wearing your worst, most worn-out clothes. Even then, the thorns would find ways to tear through fabric and scratch skin. The visible scratches marked you as someone who foraged for survival. The best berries were always deep in the thicket where the thorns were thickest. You'd have to reach far into the brambles, getting scratched repeatedly to get the largest, ripest berries. The pain was constant. but hunger motivated people to endure it. Snakes loved blackberry thickets because rodents fed on fallen berries. Rattlesnakes would coil in the shade under the brambles, and reaching in to pick berries meant risking a snake bite. Several poor settlers died from snake bites received while picking blackberries. The harvest window for wild blackberries and raspberries was short. The berries would ripen over about 2 weeks. And if you didn't pick them quickly, they'd rot or be eaten by birds and animals. Poor families had to harvest aggressively during this window despite the pain and danger. Fresh wild blackberries and raspberries were actually pleasant to eat, which was rare for wild fruits. This made them valuable not just for nutrition but for morale. A handful of sweet berries provided a moment of pleasure in otherwise harsh lives. Most berries were preserved as jam or dried for winter use. The jam required sugar, which poor families often couldn't afford in sufficient quantities. The resulting preserves were less sweet than middle-class versions, but they still provided vitamins through winter. The competition for good. Blackberry patches was intense. Families would return to the same patches year after year, considering them their spots even though the land was public. Disputes over blackberry picking rights led to arguments and occasionally violence. But some wild fruits didn't require fighting other people. You just had to survive the environment where they grew. Currants and gooseberries grew wild in cooler regions and mountain areas. These tart berries were smaller than cultivated varieties and required significant labor to gather in useful quantities. But they were reliable and grew in places where other fruits didn't. Wild currants were tiny, maybe the size of a pea. They grew in clusters, which made picking slightly easier than scattered berries. But you still needed to pick hundreds to get a meaningful amount of fruit. The work was tedious and time-consuming. The flavor was intensely tart, almost sour. Eating them fresh would make your face pucker. Most poor families would make them into jelly if they could afford sugar, or dry them for winter use. Dried currants were hard and sour, but provided vitamins when nothing else was available. Gooseberries were larger than currants, but covered in tiny spines that would irritate your hands during picking. The spines weren't as bad as blackberry thorns, but they'd make your hands itch and burn. After a day of picking gooseberries, your hands would be red and uncomfortable. The berries themselves were tart and sometimes bitter. They required significant sugar to be palatable, which poor families often couldn't provide. Gooseberry preserves made with minimal sugar were barely edible, but they kept people from starving. Wild currants and gooseberries grew in areas that were often difficult to access. Mountain slopes, rocky areas, and dense forests were common locations. Getting to the berries meant hiking long distances over difficult terrain while carrying containers for the harvest. The harvest had to happen in summer. When the berries were ripe, which was also when other work was most demanding, poor families had to balance the need to gather wild fruit against the need to work for wages or tend their own small gardens. Children were often sent to gather currants and gooseberries while adults did other work. This meant children as young as 6 or 7 would be hiking alone in wilderness areas, facing dangers from wildlife, weather, and getting lost. Some children died during wild fruit gathering expeditions. The yields were unpredictable. Some years the bushes would be loaded with fruit. Other years, late frosts or drought would kill the crop. Poor families couldn't count on wild currants and gooseberries. They just hoped for the best and gathered what they could. Speaking of unpredictable harvests, some wild fruits were so bitter that only the truly desperate would eat them. Wild strawberries grew in meadows and forest clearings throughout the West. These weren't the large, sweet strawberries. We know today they were tiny, maybe the size of a fingernail, and you'd need to pick hundreds to get a handful. But they were sweet when ripe, making them worth the enormous labor. The berries were so small that picking them was almost meditative in its tedium. You'd crouch in a meadow for hours, picking tiny berries one at a time. Your back would ache, your fingers would cramp, and you'd have very little to show for your effort. A full day of picking wild strawberries might yield a quart if you were lucky and the patch was productive. That's 8 hours of back-breaking labor for a quart of berries. but for poor families with no other options, it was worth it. The flavor was intense, much stronger than cultivated strawberries. The sweetness was concentrated in those tiny berries. Eating them fresh was a rare treat that made the labor seem worthwhile. Children would eat as many as they picked, which frustrated parents who needed the berries for preservation. Wild strawberries couldn't be preserved easily because they were so small and delicate. They turned to mush when cooked. Most families ate them fresh or dried them, though dried wild strawberries were barely worth the effort given how small they were. The patches where wild strawberries grew were often in full sun, meaning pickers would be exposed to heat for hours. Sunburn, heat exhaustion, and dehydration were real dangers. Poor families would sometimes get sick from spending too long in the sun picking tiny berries. Competition with wildlife was intense. Birds, rodents, and insects all fed on wild strawberries. You'd often find that insects had gotten to the berries first, leaving them damaged or inedible. The percentage of berries that were actually harvestable was often low. The harvest window was extremely short, maybe a week. Wild strawberries would ripen quickly and then be gone. If you missed the window because you were working elsewhere or didn't know about the patch, you'd get nothing. Some poor families would try to transplant wild strawberry plants to their own property, hoping to cultivate them. This rarely worked because wild strawberries didn't transplant well and required specific conditions. The effort usually resulted in dead plants and wasted labor. But the most desperate wild fruit gathering happened in the desert, where survival itself was questionable. Prickly pear cactus fruit called tunas were a staple for poor settlers in the Southwest. These fruits grew on cactus pads covered in spines, making harvest dangerous and painful. But in desert regions where other fruits didn't grow, prickly pear was often the only option. The fruit itself was covered in tiny hair-like spines called glochids. These were almost invisible but would embed in your skin by the hundreds if you touched the fruit carelessly. The spines were barbed and incredibly difficult to remove. They'd cause itching and pain for days. Harvesting prickly pear fruit required tools and technique. Settlers would use sticks or tongs to knock the fruit off the cactus, then roll them in sand or dirt to remove some of the glochids. Even with precautions, you'd usually end up with spines in your hands. The fruit had to be carefully peeled to remove the skin and remaining spines. This was delicate work that required patience and skill. Rushing the process meant getting spines in your mouth, which was extremely painful and could cause serious problems if you swallowed them. The flesh inside was sweet and actually pleasant when you could get to it safely. The flavor was unique, slightly watermelon-like with its own distinctive taste. In the desert heat, the moisture in prickly pear fruit was as valuable as the calories. Poor families would make prickly pear jelly if they could afford sugar. The jelly was beautiful, a deep magenta color, and actually tasted good. This was one of the few wild fruit preserves that was genuinely enjoyable rather than merely tolerable. The poor seeds in prickly pear fruit were hard and numerous. You could eat them, but they'd pass through your digestive system unchanged. Some people would spit them out, but that was tedious given how many seeds each fruit contained. Prickly pear harvest happened in late summer when the desert was at its hottest. Picking fruit in 100-degree heat while dealing with spines was brutal work. Heat exhaustion and dehydration were constant dangers. Some poor settlers died while harvesting prickly pear. The cactus pads themselves were also edible and were used by poor families as a vegetable. The pads had to be carefully despined and cooked. They were slimy when cooked, which many people found unpleasant, but they provided nutrition when nothing else was available. So there you have it. Wild fruits in the Wild West weren't nature's bounty or pleasant foraging experiences. They were desperate survival measures that kept poor settlers alive when starvation was the alternative. The fruits were bitter, sour, difficult to harvest, and often dangerous to gather. But they were free. And for people with no money and no land, free meant the difference between living and dying. Makes you appreciate modern grocery stores, doesn't it? Those poor settlers would be amazed that we complain about fruit prices when we have access to sweet, cultivated varieties year-round. They'd probably laugh at us for thinking we have it hard when we don't have to risk snake bites, bear attacks, and painful thorns just to get a handful of bitter berries that barely kept us alive.